Ladies and gentlemen, all those joining in this call from, I think, not only Oxford, but actually elsewhere in the UK and indeed around the world from what I can see. A great pleasure to have you with us for this lunchtime seminar. My name is Rana Mitter. I'm a historian of modern China, also working on contemporary politics. My job today is as host for both a celebration of a new book by one of our community and also a discussion of its immensely timely contents. So that book is, that book and that author, I should say, is One Belt, One Road, Chinese Power Meets the World by Eyck Freymann, which has just been published a couple of weeks ago by the Asia Center of Harvard University and is distributed through Harvard University Press, and indeed is available now. And I don't know, sorry, Eyck, if you might want to just show us the cover of the book, which is a very, very splendid depiction there of Xi Jinping as an imperial figure, and that's something we'll get to. Let me briefly introduce Eyck Freymann to you, for those who don't know him already. Eyck is currently a doctoral candidate for the DPhil in area studies with a specialization on China here at Oxford University, but he has a previous distinguished career as a student at Harvard and has been published or indeed cited in major publications, including the New York Times, The Economist, and The Atlantic. And indeed, this book, One Belt, One Road, has been discussed in The Economist magazine quite recently. But no need for us at this point to turn to the popular prints, Eyck, because we have you in person, I'm very glad to say. Welcome to this session. I'm just going to explain what we'll do today is that Eyck and I will be in conversation for about 35 minutes or so on the subject of his very, very interesting book. And we will then open up to questions and answers. And as we're using our new Zoom webinar function here from the China Center, could I ask that you put your questions to me to pass on to Eyck, either, well, I think actually the easiest way is either through the Q&A function, which you'll see is available, or through the chat function. Either one of those is okay. I'll keep an eye on both of those, and we'll try and pass on as many of those questions as possible to Eyck before we finish at 2 o'clock GMT today. So Eyck, welcome. Congratulations again on the publication of the new book. And let's spend a little time finding out what you are arguing and why you feel that we need to look at this topic. Because One Belt, One Road, OBOR, or the Belt and Road Initiative, is a topic that, you know, those of us who are dealing with contemporary China cannot avoid. And yet my sense from reading this book is almost a sense of kind of scholarly frustration, if I may put it that way. In other words, that it's something that everyone, at least in the China world, talks about, but very few people seem really to have a clear and nuanced analysis of. Is that a fair description of the purpose of your book, would you say?
Yes, it is, Rana. And let me say thank you so much for hosting. I'm so pleased to be here at Oxford sharing the findings of this exciting project. And thank you to everyone, 46 participants now, for zooming in. I hope to engage your attention the rest of this hour. So yes, I think that One Belt, One Road is to a very large extent a slogan in search of a policy. It was announced only a few months after Xi Jinping took power in September of 2013 on a trip to Kazakhstan. And it has since been institutionalized within the Chinese party state to the extent that every Chinese province, virtually every major Chinese city, every major Chinese state-owned enterprise and private company, and indeed any number of large international companies from Walmart to Samsung to Boeing to Allianz that are operating in China have learned that this slogan, One Belt, One Road, is something akin to an open sesame that makes it possible to access not only political favor, but large amounts of capital and favored projects within the Chinese market. And yet I think there's a lack of understanding to what extent One Belt, One Road actually refers to a coherent national strategy, a grand plan from China, and if so, whether that is primarily physical in terms of building out an infrastructure network to reconnect China to the world through roads, bridges, airports, electrical infrastructure, fiber optic, and so forth. And to what extent it's more of a conceptual innovation, a metaphor, if you will, for reviving the the ancient Silk Road in a modern form, and what that means for China metaphorically to be back at the center of the world. So I think that there's been an impulse in the West to think of it basically as an investment initiative, because indeed, since the early 2000s, China has undertaken over $2 trillion of foreign direct investment around the world. Much of that has been financed by state-owned banks through opaque deals, and a great deal of it, hundreds of billions of dollars of it, has gone to enormous, what we might call strategic infrastructure built from scratch, which might have some sort of political purpose or might pay off on a timescale of decades, but has very little chance of making money in the short term. So the question has been raised most recently by the Trump administration: is this in fact a debt diplomacy strategy? In a sense, to export Chinese capital, Chinese dollars abroad, and use it as a trap to ensnare poorer countries into debt and therefore political fealty to China. So the argument of this book is that the discussion about One Belt, One Road, particularly in the English language literature and in Washington, has been misguided. That we should think of this fundamentally not as some grand plan to reconnect the world through infrastructure, but as a domestic political campaign to install Xi Jinping right at the center of the party state ecosystem and to write himself into the pantheon of China's greatest leaders. And in the process, it has spillover effects as all kinds of entities within the Chinese system and without try to jump on the bandwagon for their own gain. So it's the story of this conceptual mishmash sort of gaining momentum over time, to the point that here, as we speak in 2021, almost a year into a global pandemic, we have 136 countries that have signed deals swearing on some level their political agreement with the basic principles of the Belt and Road. And you have statements from the highest levels of the Chinese Communist Party that the Belt and Road is going to be a strategic priority going out of the pandemic.
I thank you for that very cogent explanation of the purpose of the book. And you've left a lot of trails there that I want to pick up in terms of discussing what I think I call the policy prescriptions actually of the book, because certainly the last section has a really neatly delineated set of options for the Western world, particularly the US, but not just the US, when it comes to dealing with One Belt, One Road. And I do want to come back to that near the end. Before we do that, I'd like to take our listeners, if I may, through a little bit more of the detail that you go through, because I think one of the things that makes this book very, very distinctive is that it's based on a tremendous amount of extremely detailed research. And I'm sure you'll tell us a little bit about some of the way that you managed to find those sources as we get through some of the key topics. But let me start, if I may, by something that actually has been a subject of some speculation in general discussions about One Belt, One Road. And that's where the idea actually comes from in the first place. Because I guess for a lot of people, there's this moment in 2013 in the city of Astana in Kazakhstan, where President Xi Jinping, General Secretary Xi Jinping, turns up and makes this speech, which is seen as the sort of starting gun, as it were. And yet, as you point out, actually, an awful lot of people had to do an awful lot of writing and thinking and debating to get to the point of that talk, which wasn't even in Beijing, but actually was in a different country. Could you tell us a little bit about the processes by which what we now think of as One Belt, One Road actually came into existence?
Thank you. I think that's a good place to start. So One Belt, One Road refers, in theory, to the two component initiatives that comprise the plan. The first is an overland Silk Road Economic Belt, or the SREB, that is supposedly intended to connect the Eurasian landmass through infrastructure, ostensibly connecting China to Europe by rail so that products produced in China can be delivered to Europe without passing by sea. And then there is a somewhat misleadingly named Road on the Sea, which is a maritime Silk Road, or MSR, which extends from the port cities, the coastal cities of southern China in Fujian province, down along the rim of the South China Sea, along through the Straits of Malacca, along the rim of the Indian Ocean, through the Suez Canal, and then to Europe, entering Europe either through the Greek port of Piraeus or the Dutch port of Rotterdam. But of course, this is not only a misleading representation of the infrastructure that is actually being built, it's also, in a sense, a rebrand of this idea of the Silk Road, or the so-called New Silk Road. The Chinese call it the 新的丝绸之路, the New Silk Road, which has been floating around in the Chinese system for decades. So one of the things that I do in the first chapters of the book is I trace the genesis of this concept of the Silk Road, which was in fact not a named thing in Imperial China. And the term Silk Road itself, in German, it's Die Seidenstraße, was coined by German Orientalists in the 19th century, who were making the case for German colonial expansion into China. And they hoped that by creating a sense of a historic legacy of an interconnected, trade-linked Eurasian hinterland, that they could persuade the German government to invest in these pretty far-fetched schemes of connecting China to Europe by road and rail. So this was then a favorite idea of a Nazi sympathizer Swede named Sven Hedden in the 1930s, who, funded by Lufthansa and the Nazi government, traveled to China and created from scratch, and with no historical basis at all, a legend that in fact the Silk Road had been a strategic initiative of Han Wudi, the great Chinese emperor of the 2nd and 1st centuries BC, widely regarded as the greatest emperor in Chinese history because he expanded the size of the Han state, and said, well, in fact, it was Han Wudi and his loyal emissaries who cracked open the Central Asian deserts and connected Europe to Asia by trade. And look how China and everyone else benefited, so you should maybe rebuild it. The Chinese at the time thought that was ridiculous. They called it the so-called Silk Road, the Suowei Sulu. But the idea stuck because the idea of a historical heritage of peaceful trade between China and its neighbors in Central Asia had a diplomatic function. And so in the 1980s, and particularly after the fall of the Soviet Union, you start to see examples of Chinese diplomats in their interactions with Central Asian peers talking about rebuilding the Silk Road as a metaphor for cooperation. And in fact, the Central Asians themselves like it because they think they can use it to constrain potential Chinese expansionism. So this gets developed in the Chinese bureaucratic discourse to the point that Xi Jinping's predecessors are actually traveling around the world, visiting places like the Middle East and talking about the new Silk Road as a metaphor for the sorts of infrastructure projects they're going to build together. So when I started this project, one of the things that struck me as odd was that Xi Jinping not only claims that this is going to define his legacy, rebuilding the new Silk Road, he also says it's his idea and that no one before him has ever proposed this idea. And that was sort of curious to me because it flew in the face of stuff that clearly everyone in the Chinese system would have known, because the slogan was in the speeches of Xi's immediate predecessors. So I began to wonder then, to what extent does it feed into his cult of personality? And to what extent does the factual inaccuracy of this claim that he invented it actually serve as an assertion of power within the system, when leading entities within the Chinese propaganda apparatus, like the People's Daily or Chinese Central Television, resolutely repeat this claim that it was Xi Jinping and Xi Jinping alone who created this concept.
You mentioned in that answer, Eyck, the kind of origins back in the 19th century with the kind of German fantasies around this, the figure of the Han Dynasty Emperor Wudi. And I would be remiss if I did not point out that one of the many attractions of your book is the very splendid full color dust jacket, which shows none other than President Xi Jinping dressed up essentially as if he were the Emperor Han Wudi. But this isn't just a sort of flight of fancy on your part. In the book, you argue quite strongly that something that really, I think it's fair to say, goes almost unnoticed in the Western discussion about One Belt, One Road, is actually quite central to the way in which it's being configured in Chinese politics and society. So could you fill in the gaps for us? What is the connection between this emperor of some 2000 years ago and the current general secretary of the Communist Party of China? And how do they come together on this one belt and one road idea?
So Han Wudi is, with good justification, regarded as one of the greatest emperors in Chinese history. He oversaw the doubling of Chinese territory. He successfully acquired territories that are now central to China, the provinces of Fujian, Guangdong, Guangxi, Yunnan. Hong Kong now was added to the Han Dynasty by his military escapades. He invaded Vietnam successfully. He invaded the Korean Peninsula largely successfully. And he commenced a series of invasions into the so-called Western regions, along the Heshi corridor in modern-day Gansu province and into Xinjiang, that punched a way into the Western regions and allowed future Chinese dynasties, such as the Tang, to dominate a vast amount of territory in Central Asia. He also ruled for over 50 years. He oversaw a period of technological and economic productivity and growth in China. And it was a period in particular of political stability. And that, I think, is one of the resonances that Xi Jinping is trying to evoke. So by tying himself to the mast of Han Wudi, he's making no small claim that he deserves to be compared to one of the greatest emperors in Chinese history. And the fact that no Chinese textbook or serious historian before Xi Jinping has ever given Han Wudi credit for starting the original Silk Road has not, in fact, served as an obstacle. And one of the things that I discussed was how in 2016, the Chinese Ministry of Education undertook a full-scale rewriting of the history textbooks that all junior high and high school students must study and be assessed on before they can enter university. And this involved the assertion of wildly implausible and factually baseless new claims that, in fact, Han Wudi had created maritime roads that went all the way to Europe, when there was absolutely no way that clearly could have happened before the Suez Canal. But this is now part of a canon of Chinese ancient history that Chinese students must study. So there's been an effort done on both ends to rewrite the underlying history of Han Wudi's reign, to bring it into closer juxtaposition to what Xi Jinping is trying to do. And there has been an effort in Belt and Road propaganda from Chinese Central Television to, in a sense, rewrite the history of the world such that China's imperial power was at its apex and China's status in the world system was at its greatest under Han Wudi. It has been laid low by the last few hundred years of the rise of the West. And it's Xi Jinping, the glorious reformer, but also the virtuous traditionalist, who's going to restore that imperial order in a modern form.
So that mention of propaganda, of narrative, of creating a new set of ideas brings to mind, again, one of the other very interesting sections of the book, Eyck, which is the way in which, it seems to me, you're arguing that actually there are really at least two major narratives about One Belt, One Road emerging from China, one of which is very much for domestic consumption, and one of which is about promoting the idea overseas. And it seems that the two don't necessarily interact very much. But actually, one of the slightly more provocative things you suggest is that maybe to some extent, there's actually not much interest in China, or at least in the Chinese propaganda institutions, in putting forward a terribly convincing story about One Belt, One Road to a Western audience. And I think part of the evidence is actually a video, which I've certainly seen and others may be familiar with, of bedtime story being told about the One Belt, One Road by, I think, an American to his daughter, which, you know, to most people watching it, including, I suspect, most Chinese viewers, looks fairly sort of slapdash. It's pretty sentimental and saccharine without having very much content to it, and actually gives the impression, as I think you're implying, that maybe this is not something on which anyone has spent any huge amount of time or effort or money. It's just basically been put together. So is there a sort of divergent set of narratives, a domestic and an international, about Obor? And perhaps particularly interestingly, what's in the Chinese version that the rest of the world doesn't see?
Well, I think that's a very good point. That is indeed one of the main arguments of the book. And I think there's no better example of it than in the renaming that the Chinese have tried to do in the past few years. So the Chinese term, One Belt, One Road, 一带一路, has a very specific ring and set of resonances to a domestic audiences, right? Because idai, ilu, it creates a sense of a harmonious balance of two things which combine to something greater. You could talk to ifu iqi, one husband, one wife, which when placed together refers to the broader concept of marriage. And there's many other examples of this in the Chinese language. It's gesturing at a broad concept for China's harmonious interactions with foreigners. But it renders strangely in English, one belt, one road. Do you put a comma in the middle or not? It's not clear. And so one of the interesting decisions that was taken by the Central Translation Bureau, and I believe 2016, was to rebrand this thing in English as the Belt and Road Initiative, or the BRI. And this one of the questions that I got from peer reviewers and from my editor was whether, in fact, calling it One Belt, One Road is accurate, since the Chinese system has clearly decided that they don't like the name anymore, even though they never renamed it in Chinese itself. And I made the argument that it's important to, if we want to treat this as it actually is, as is understood by domestic players, we need to continue to refer to it by its original and true name. By extension, we could look at one country, two systems, 一国两制, right, which is the legalistic term that China uses to describe Hong Kong's independence, or legal, not independence, then legal semi-sovereignty. And if the Chinese were to decide tomorrow that they would start translating 一国两制 from the one country, two systems to the country and systems initiative, we would probably and justifiably say that sounds like an attempt to use the translation change to make a claim on some of Hong Kong's sovereign rights. And so we would probably not accept that. And this is one reason why the governments of the United States and India have refused to go along with calling Idailu the Belt and Road Initiative, and they still call it OBOR.
I want to move in a moment to talking more about the international implications of One Belt, One Road, as I think for these purposes we'll call it, but just something that maybe is less explicitly dealt with in your book, but I think is something you must have been thinking about over the last year or so while it's been in press. There's been a lot of talk, often not very grounded talk, about a sense that particularly with the current financial crisis, the coronavirus crisis and so forth, that maybe there's less enthusiasm within China itself for the idea of the whole initiative. Do you think there is any sense in which there's been a sort of changing feeling about it, or does it remain just as central as before in terms of both the way in which the party state thinks about itself and about the way that the wider population and public sphere engages with the idea?
So I think there has always been opposition within the Chinese system to One Belt, One Road, at least insofar as it entails spending hundreds of billions of dollars overseas. I think to many foreigners, particularly people in Washington who've never been outside of the major Chinese cities, China is perceived as this behemoth. And it's easy to forget that it's still a developing country in many respects. It still has enormous problems of poverty. Many parts of the country are underdeveloped. And the wealth is distributed even more unequally than in the United States. So there is a sense from a lot of people within China that it is too early in the developmental arc for China to concern itself with spending its surplus capital overseas. There are developmental problems, public health issues, education issues, connectivity issues that should be addressed inside China. So I think all sorts of entities within the system, in particular businesses, that recognize that they had to be on the favored side of this thing to pull money out of China, went along with the phrase, with the slogan in principle. But there was still a lot of foot dragging, a lot of opposition. And I think we can see that in one way through the scattershot implementation and the failure of the leading cadres in Beijing to actually get control of what was happening on the ground. That's why we have everything from Belt and Road football games to Belt and Road opera performances and blood drives, Belt and Road kitchenware manufacturers meetings, and so forth. And so I think as there has been an effort over time to consolidate this centrally, there have been winners and losers, and some entities that have been able to acquire large amounts of capital, but there have been others who have been denied it. And one thing that has actually been found by people who've taken quantitative approaches to looking at how the money is distributed is, rather than serving China's developmental goals, most of the money has ended up going to provinces like Zhejiang in the coast, which is one of the wealthiest provinces in China. It's certainly not where China's most urgent developmental needs are. I think also there's a recognition that under the Trump administration's pressure and under basically as American and Western diplomats have started to call this a debt trap, there's been a recognition that in fact many of these projects were half-baked and are likely to lose money. But that's not to say that the Belt and Road has died of coronavirus, because there's a whole lot that the Chinese government can do just by bending the concept or referring the slogan into new domains that can allow them to pivot from the heavy infrastructure that they were building between 2013 and 2020 to perhaps green, digital, or public health programs next. And so this is what I would expect that we see in 2021, as developing countries are likely to face a lot of debt distress. You're going to see less focus on implementing new projects like roads, bridges, and the like. And you're going to see China's efforts to roll out its COVID vaccines branded under the umbrella of the Health Silk Road and that sort of thing.
Yeah, and certainly the amount of attention on the Green Silk Road, the Health Silk Road, and the Digital Silk Road in the last few months, particularly as the pandemic seems to have changed the way in which the Chinese state chooses to project itself, is very noticeable and is clearly a sort of work in progress, you might say, not least perhaps for the paperback edition of the book in due course. Your book also, Eyck, goes through actually in huge and really admirable detail case studies in several countries as well as regions. And I wish we had the time to go through them all, but because time is pressing, I'm going to sort of take chair's privilege and dive right into one or two cases to ask you about them, and recommend that others, pick up the book and read about the rest. I mean, you looked at Tanzania, you looked at Greece, you looked at Sri Lanka. You mentioned debt diplomacy, and let's be honest, it's one of the phrases, correctly or otherwise, that people tend to associate at least with what you might call the headline version of One Belt, One Road. So can you tell us a little bit more about one case that I thought was dealt with great nuance? That's the Sri Lanka case. I mean, again, the headline version of this, I think has become quite well known amongst those who keep an eye on China. So the Hambantota port, built or constructed in part with loans provided by one of the Chinese banks, China Exim Bank, but anyway. Then it's found under the turbulence of Sri Lanka's politics that it's not possible for the loan to be paid back in full form. And then with a sort of historical chill to the mind, the idea that the Chinese interests would keep control of the port for 99 years, of course, famously exactly the same time as the new territories when Britain took over those in Hong Kong, was very much on people's minds, thereby giving a lot of weight to a narrative, accurate or otherwise, of a sort of neo-colonialism. Now, I think it's fair to say that you push back quite heavily against this overly, as you say, overly simplistic view of what happened in Sri Lanka. Could you talk us a little bit more through your case study, and do you tell us a bit about how you actually did the work to look into it as well?
So a great deal of work on the Belt and Road, including some of the very best work that has been done, has taken the form of case studies, because for as useful as it is to understand what this means strategically inside China, as we ultimately run up against the wall of the Chinese bureaucracy, which has been extraordinarily opaque with sharing its data, with sharing even lists of what countries or projects are affiliated with Belt and Road and which are outside the ambit of the initiative. And so in order to understand on a project level how an arc of a given deal will track, you have to go on the ground to the recipient country and start talking to people who have interacted with the Chinese. And I think you have to go about the disciplined exercise to speak to people outside the ruling coalition to make sure that you're hearing every perspective and you understand how those perspectives interact. So what I did with Sri Lanka is I did 2 trips. I met with people from the government, but also people from a range of opposition parties, business leaders, lawyers, journalists, civil society actors, think tank experts. And then I went to India and I solicited opinions from some military and diplomatic elites there. And then I went to Washington and I asked what American diplomats who'd worked on Sri Lanka thought, trying to hear it from all sides. And then finally, I went on the ground, I interviewed local people, and I engaged local translators, because I don't speak Sinhala, to help me understand what the Sri Lankan press was actually saying about this. And what I came away with was the realization that the United States has misdiagnosed what happened at this port. And who cares, right? Well, it matters because in 2018, when Mike Pence gave his famous speech at the Hudson Institute, announcing what many people interpreted as a declaration of new Cold War against China, he said in a whole section of that speech that China is engaged in a debt trap strategy. And if you want a paradigmatic example that could not be clearer, you should just ask Sri Lanka what it feels like to be sucked into the debt trap. And so when I went to Sri Lanka and I found that basically everyone I spoke to felt positively about China, and in fact had felt more positively about China with each passing year that they had interacted with One Belt, One Road, in spite of the failure of the Hamamatota port to make money, in spite of the fact that they had to hand it over on a 99-year lease. I began to wonder whether, in fact, the United States was underestimating the viability of this Chinese playbook. There's a reason why the Sri Lankans were happy to hand over the port, which is that it was their idea in the first place. China didn't have to coerce or trick them into taking out loans for a project that was unviable. The Sri Lankan Prime Minister, Mahinda Rajapaksa, came from this town, and as part of his legacy, wanted to bring home the bacon by building a lot of stuff that had his name on it: a port, an airport, a conference center, a road network, and so forth. Whether or not it was profitable over a 5 or 10-year horizon was not his interest. Insofar as Sri Lankan elites were concerned about making money, they were looking at Colombo Port City, a project that was an order of magnitude larger, which truly would become the most effective, efficient, and fast-growing port in South Asia, which was built with Chinese capital and Chinese civil engineering expertise. And in fact, if you visit this port, it's an amazing thing to behold. There's real estate development all around it. There's an entire economy that's emerged to service it. It's become central to Sri Lanka's development path. And so when Mahinda Rajapaksa lost his re-election in 2015, after some election meddling from the United States, his successors, fearing that this project related to his patronage networks, paused all Chinese projects in the country. They said, we have to audit this. We need to see if there's corruption going on. And if the Chinese are involved in backing Rajapaksa's patronage network, that has to stop now. But pretty soon they realized that the logic of a peer-to-peer relationship with Chinese state-owned enterprises and Chinese Communist Party elites actually served their own interests. And so Sirisena, who is Rajapaksa's successor, ended up redoubling his support of the Belt and Road, inviting Xi Jinping back to Sri Lanka for more signing ceremonies and yet more deals. And I think this is concerning because if the Belt and Road can succeed in Sri Lanka, where the Hamamatota port basically blew up and received international opprobrium, then it's a working formula to succeed almost anywhere else. And that's why I think it merits attention from even people who don't particularly know much or think much about South Asia.
Well, could I use that thought actually, just to add, we've got actually loads of questions coming in, so I'm going to turn to that in just a minute or two, I think, but also a comment that's come in from our distinguished colleague Rosemary Foote here, and I don't think you mind me naming you, Rosemary, since you've sent it to all panelists and attendees, but just to read it out, it's in the chat function. There are the real perceived international links and political and status benefits associated with OBOR, e.g. BRI linked to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Investment deals have been used to extract diplomatic concessions, e.g. attempts to divide the EU and block unified European criticism of China. Design and construction stage can lead to setting of standards, transferring Chinese standards to a wider international public. It may begin as a Xi-centric political project, but can evolve into something more. And that seems to sort of chime rather effectively with basically what you've just said there. It's a start point, not an end point.
Yeah, that's exactly, Rosemary is absolutely right. That's precisely the argument of the second half of the book. This thing that was begun in China, primarily with domestic motivations in mind, has metastasized and developed a momentum of its own. And because it has a logic that is so attractive to leaders of recipient countries, namely, give China long-term status benefits and receive short-term tangible benefits in exchange, it has staying power in not every country where it lands, but the vast majority of them. And this means that the United States, and we can probably segue now into a discussion of US interests and US options, or Western interests and Western options. I think the West does not yet have its arms around the nature of this problem or the nature of this challenge. And One Belt, One Road will continue to grow, both geographically and into new domains like digital and green and public health, until we recognize what makes it such a desirable value proposition for partner countries and put forward a more attractive competing proposal.
Well, on that point, Eyck, I think the last point that I'd like to ask you in my part of the conversation, and which is very much where your book ends up, and I think also a really good place to go into the wider Q&A, is about what the West needs to be thinking about at this point. And I think it's not like an Agatha Christie thriller, so I hope I can give away the ending in a sense here, but also encourage people to read it and read in more detail why you say this. You put forward what to many readers might be a somewhat counterintuitive case, which is that, you know, you look at the various policy options such as they are that the Western world has about sort of containment and so forth, and you end up saying, no, that's not the way to deal with One Belt, One Road. The answer for countries, including the United States, is actually to join up, get inside it, and then basically change it from within. And you point out that there are problems of various sorts with this, both in terms of practicality and in terms of perhaps issues of prestige, as you put it. But you do put it forward as a serious proposal to engage with it. Could you say a bit more about why that was your end conclusion and where, you know, both the possibilities and problems with that as a solution to engaging with OBOR actually lie?
So thank you for that, Rana. Years ago, I worked for Graham Allison of Thucydides' Trap fame, who's taught for many years at the Harvard Kennedy School, and he says that the most common form of stupidity that he sees in American foreign policy is forgetting what it is that we are trying to do. And so his approach to analyzing any foreign policy challenge is not to start by spitting out prescriptions, but to actually think about diagnosing the challenge and thinking about how and in what ways it might bear on national interests. And in doing that analysis, Allison teaches, we need to be conscious that some national interests matter more than others. What do we care about more than the other things we care about? So at the highest level of that discussion, we can look at American vital interest or Western vital interests. And vital interests, Allison defines as the actual lives and livelihoods of our people and the structural integrity of our institutions. So I think it's hard to make the case, even if you think creatively and in the most paranoid attitude about where Belt and Road could evolve over time. It's hard to see how it directly threatens Western lives or Western political institutions. It could erode, perhaps, democratic institutions in more peripheral parts of the world, and that's a concern. But it's not ultimately something that, for example, risks war with China. I happen to come down on Allison's side that I think the longer term trajectory of US-China relations is very dangerous. I think we're spiraling into what could be an uncontrolled geopolitical rivalry with a variety of new and terrifying capabilities to damage each other that the US and the Soviet Union didn't have in the Cold War. And I'm also conscious that there's other problems like climate change, which are in a sense existential to both sides, that can only be resolved if the US and China work together. And finally, I recognize that One Belt, One Road, if it does what it claims to do, is not such a bad thing. I mean, the West should be happy that roads are being built in Zambia. Maybe we're not happy that how they're being financed, but anything that helps development for the world's poorest economies is not only an intrinsic good for human development, it's also an economic good that all of us can ultimately share in. So I think it's in our interest to let China know that there is a place for them to rise within the international order in terms that are desirable to its current leadership. I mean, if we were having a discussion about seeking regime change in China, then maybe it would be advantageous to pursue a policy of weakening or delegitimizing the Belt and Road within China. But if that's not one of our objectives, and I don't think it should be, then we need to think about an end state that Xi Jinping would be happy living with. And if the analysis in this book is correct, and this is first and foremost about consolidating his domestic control, then the easiest win to hand him is to let him present himself as an emperor and sleep well at night, and then to confront more aggressively in areas where it actually does touch our strategic interests. For example, we could draw red lines and say, no Belt and Road in the Caribbean, no Huawei in our critical 5G infrastructure. We're going to write the rules of foreign investment to make sure that you can't buy Western AI or robotics technology. We can still, on the margins, assert our interests, but we'll have more credibility to do that if we give China credit for contributing to international development when it actually does so.
Thank you. And questions are now kind of really rolling in. So what I'm going to do is to put a few of them together and put them back to you, particularly where there's a sort of combined theme. And I think the first two come from two old friends of the seminar and of this community, from Professor Vivian Xu and Dr. Federica Ferlanti. So Vivian's question is, you say that part of Xi Jinping's purpose in promoting the BRI is to restore the imperial order. Could you say more about what that restoration of a new Chinese imperium might actually entail going forward, both for those states and nations engaging with China as partners in the BRI and for politics, society, and economy inside China itself? And then off the back of that, in a sense, Federica's question is, it seems to me that a fundamental aspect of One Belt, One Road is that it talks to a domestic audience. So I wonder whether the domestic message, internal propaganda are nuanced and take into account, adjusted to different constituents, social classes in China, and if so, in what ways, and how is it received by those different audiences domestically? So perhaps we put those two together, I can throw them back to you.
Sure. So they're very good questions. I think it's hard to speak with any confidence on how One Belt, One Road is perceived by, say, your average person on the street in China. We don't have good opinion polling. We don't have an independent media. Social media has actually more vibrant discussion of political and social issues than most Western commentators might assume, but it's not entirely free. And I think as it has become clear to all that One Belt, One Road is intimately linked to Xi Jinping's own legacy, it becomes hard to criticize it, at least hard to criticize it explicitly. The propaganda that I have looked at have not, in fact, talked very much about Chinese development. All that they have done is stated in the most abstract of terms that what we are doing is, in a sense, is rebuilding an ancient model of governed by the Silk Road spirit. In other words, we don't have to, we being China, don't have to assert our interests on other countries by force. We have the technology, we have the market, and so others will come to us. And others will acknowledge our status in return for getting access to that technology and that market. And so we can restore our centrality within the international system and gain not only status, but also wealth if we play along with this thing that our neighbors are essentially asking for. Vivian's question has to do with the restoration of the imperial order. I'm not an imperial historian, Rana, as you know, but I am interested in the ways that this history has been simplified, dumbed down, and repackaged for a contemporary audience. And so obviously anyone who has studied the ancient Silk Road, or indeed the scholarly debate on the imperial tributary system would tell you it's not a thing. right? It was never an organized thing that persisted for hundreds of years, whereby the foreigners would visit Beijing and kowtow to the emperor and come away with goodies. And yet this has become, on its very highest, most conceptual level, part of the story that Chinese propaganda is spinning, something that used to happen and something that is being restored. So the myth, in a sense, is taking on a reality of its own, irrespective of the historical facts. So the historians who are watching now are probably groaning, but I'll probably end my comment there.
No, thanks for that. And I think anyone who, well, you're quite right. In a sense, it's what some people call auto-Orientalism, which is the kind of creation of a mythic narrative around some supposed Eastern habit that never actually happened in real life. And Peter Perdue's article is a sort of classic, excellent one about why the tribute system never existed, but nonetheless, everyone, both East and West, keeps talking about it anyway. I think John King Fairbank has something to do with that too, but we won't go down that particular Harvard route right now. May I throw to you another question that's come in from Julia Pameli? And the question is, really interesting presentation, thank you, of course. Are there any new domestic risks for China if they do pivot to green/digital/health Silk Roads and away from large traditional infrastructural projects? The obvious upside is that there's less financial risk, but what do you think might be the downsides? Great question.
Oh, that's a great question. So I think the best way to think about it is that a lot of these, if you've ever seen the American movie Field of Dreams, wonderful, corny movie. Kevin Costner gets told, if you build a baseball field in your Iowa cornfield, people will come to play, and the spirits of the greats will actually come to play in your field. And this, in a sense, is the way that a lot of Chinese entities, state-owned enterprises, banks, and so forth, have thought about a pattern for development. If you look at how China has tried to develop its western, its interior provinces, whole cities have been built from scratch. And one of the features of this approach is that if you build just a city in the middle of nowhere, no one will use it. But if you can actually stay committed enough and put up enough money up front to build all of the ancillary infrastructure to connect that city to your other cities and make it economically viable in its own right, yes, maybe it can. And then if you have the political capacity to move enough population there to populate it, then you can somehow will it into being. And I think something that Chinese enterprises have found on the ground is that they can perhaps build individual pieces of a vision for replicating that model overseas. But because they have to interact with local interest groups, and because the timeline of domestic politics in the recipient countries doesn't allow them to move fast and break things, they'll build part of the thing, they'll build the port, but they won't actually be able to build, say, the port city around it that would make it economically feasible. And so the recipient country is stuck with half a baby, something that's not capable of paying for itself. I think it is definitely the case that as recipient countries begin to face debt distress, and a lot of Chinese enterprises begin to face questions about whether they're going to get the political kudos for carrying through these projects to the end, their inclination will be to abandon stuff midstream. And so it's possible that plenty of projects which might have gone on to become profitable if they'd been carried through are in fact going to be abandoned. And so this perverse trap will actually make a lot of stuff that could have been salvaged into worthless, useless infrastructure.
Thanks for that. Still plenty of questions coming in. I'm going to put them to you. You're giving excellent answers. If you just make sure they're as concise as possible so that people who have to sort of disappear off at 2 o'clock at the top of the hour don't miss the key elements. There's some very interesting entries here from Henry Tillman. I'd suggest those who'd like to see some of the details Henry sent in, just look at the Q&A section where he's put some key information. But let me put Henry's question to you, Eyck. President Xi announced in April 2019 there's going to be 1 belt, 6 roads. And he has been involved, Henry, in an academic journal with the Chinese think tank on the Polar Silk Road, which is number 2. So his question is, do you believe that there will be 6 Silk Roads, as Xi announced? What about number 3 in particular, retracing the Spanish Silk Road from 1576, except through Panama, not Veracruz? I don't know, Henry, but he sounds like a man who knows quite a lot of detail about what he's talking about. Your witness, Eyck, go ahead.
Well, Henry, this is great. We should talk. I've looked at Panama. The Chinese are very interested in any sort of maritime choke point. So they've One thing they've been engaged in is building a gigantic oil refinery on one side of the Panama Canal and a port on the other. But I don't know anything more about the Spanish Silk Road, so drop me a line and we'll talk. I'm writing my doctoral dissertation at Oxford about the Polar Silk Road. I think that is fanciful, and I don't think it actually refers to anything real. There has been clearly approval given for entities within the Chinese system to propose their own brand extensions. So we've seen, there's a Belt and Road in outer space, there's a Belt and Road in cyberspace. I wouldn't put too much stock in these being organized initiatives. I think we should think about them on the project level.
Sorry, thanks very much, Eyck. And I'm going to put together another two questions which seem quite nicely linked. So one has come in from Rui Xingyin, and the question is, isn't it true that every generation of leaders in the CCP or China has some characteristic policy proposals? For example, reform and opening, three represents, developing the West, etc. What makes Belt and Road Initiative special when we try and analyze President Xi? In other words, isn't this sort of just same old, but with different language? And to add to that, Ioana Turcan from Sciences Po in Paris. Bonjour, Ioana. And if Xi's presidency derives its legitimacy from its economic growth and success, how viable is this legitimacy in the long term, e.g. considering slowing economic growth? And furthermore, why is this long-term mentality distinct to Chinese leaders and not adopted in Western countries? Well, if you accept the premise of that question, that's another matter, but let me put those both back to you, Eyck.
So I think it's worth mentioning not only that each Chinese leader by unspoken tradition is supposed to have his own slogan, but that the last three presidents' slogans have been, in fact, produced by the same guy, a guy named Wang Huning, who's the chief spin doctor, the only trained academic on the Politburo Standing Committee, a fascinating character, formerly a reformist in the pre-Tiananmen era who found religion and has now become one of the chief propagandists and intellectual architects of party rule. What's unique about it is the extent to which One Belt, One Road, unlike the scientific development concept or the three represents, which were the signature policies of Xi's predecessors, has been forcibly imposed on the party. And the best example, I think, is how at the 19th Party Congress, when Xi Jinping effectively removed term limits so he could rule for life, One Belt, One Road was written alongside Xi Jinping thought into the National Party Constitution. So that was something that neither of Xi's predecessors was able to pull off. And I think that was the first indication that this has considerable staying power. And Xi Jinping is likely to continue to pursue it as long as he remains in office. And it's possible that it will become so entrenched, by the way, that even if he formally steps aside, that his successors will have to continue it, or at least to gesture at it, if in name only. As far as this question of whether it's a uniquely Chinese model to be so status obsessed, I actually don't think that's the case. I think it's pretty unlikely that the United States would follow my prescription to try to join the Belt and Road in name only, if only to celebrate China's successes and call attention to its more dubious projects. I think that's because the United States might in fact be just as status obsessed as China. And there's some discussion of that towards the end of the book as well.
Well, thanks, Eyck. And that actually lets me come straight into the next question, which comes in from Nicholas Bradbury. And Nick has written, arguably, Western aid and lending are often tied to the goal of bringing about a political outcome in the recipient countries, such as democratic government. Is this perhaps why we interpret OBOR in this guise, i.e. we project onto the Chinese the idea that they want to change other types of government? Do you, Eyck, think that interpreting OBOR as a political initiative is in fact an indication that regime change is the ultimate goal for the US, or at least under President Trump?
It's an interesting question. I don't know if I follow the second part of it.
It's meant to be a sort of Freudian projection there. I hope I'm not misquoting or misinterpreting you there, Nick, on the grounds that because the West, or at least the United States, likes to think that what it does is to provide aid, at least in some cases, to try and create or firm up democratic governance, it is a natural tick for the US also to assume that when China does similar sorts of things, it's also aiming to create a new sort of system where it is. So it's a sort of mirroring and projection of one's own intentions onto someone else, but with a rather different end goal in mind.
I mean, it's possible in some ways, but I think that if you actually go to the solution, as I try to do in the book, is to go to some of these countries and interview local people from the elite level on down to the people on the street and see what they think about it. And then to look systematically at what is said in various media in these countries over time. And so the question, in other words, is not what does China want? What change is China trying to bring about in this recipient country, but what does this recipient country perceive China's motives to be? And why are they actually signing up for this in the first place, in spite of what they hear? I think that the problem with this simplistic Western idea, it's not really a Western idea, it's an American idea, that the Belt and Road is just a debt trap play, is that we're given no agency at all to the elites in these recipient countries, who are very sophisticated actors who often have, degrees from the best Western institutions, but also long careers serving on both sides, both in their own governments and often at places like the World Bank and the IMF. If you are in the finance ministry of an African country at any level, you are keenly aware that all foreign money comes with strings attached. The question is, what kinds of strings? And I think one of the features that China has tried to push is that China's money comes with fewer strings attached than Western money. It comes with fewer strings attached in terms of making changes to your own system, but it also comes with fewer strings in the sense that the Chinese are willing to overlook issues in environmental or community impact assessments. And that's a big deal, because if you're a politician in a recipient country and you want to build a road, and working with the Japanese means that construction only begins in 4 years' time after your next election, well, that might be good for your country, but it's not very useful for you personally, staying in power at the next time you face the voters. Conversely, when you do a deal with China, the whole point is that it's going to enable you to stay in power in order to bring that project to a successful conclusion. So money will start being dispersed immediately after you sign the papers. Maybe not all the money, but some of it. And you can begin to work with your local networks on the ground in order to make the project a success on your own terms. And so because it has this logic for recipient country actors, I think it's very simplistic to say that China is coercing or tricking these countries into taking out debt. Countries know exactly what they're doing, and the senior officials there often have personal reasons for doing so. Now, you can say that in itself is China exporting a crony capitalist model of development. And I think there's a very strong argument that that is in fact what China is doing. Is that the point? Well, it's as much recipient countries as China that is asking for that outcome and making it the case.
Could I, as we come to the end here, I just ask you a final follow-up question that comes, I think, just off the back of that, for a brief answer, if I may, but I think it gets to the heart of what I think a lot of people probably watching this seminar, and I think eagerly looking out for your book, will want to know in the end, which is this. Having read the book, it seems to me that you're very objective, and you talk about the good and the bad, and what's problematic and what isn't. And at times it's slightly harder to see where in the end you come down on something perhaps you don't think is that important, but which is very much part of what I call the headline story of Obor, which is the moral freight of China's greater presence in the world. Could I put to you what I took from the book, and perhaps as your final thought, tell me whether or not this is A, what you meant, and B, if it's fair, which is that as things stand, Obor, as opposed to other issues that we all know China has within its own domestic politics, but Obor itself, in terms of the provision of spending capacity either through loans from China's own development banks, or in some cases, perhaps about 10% of the total straight FDI, actually probably serves more than anything else to exaggerate the characteristics of the society where it lands. So if you're Greece and you're a perfectly essentially stable but impoverished European democracy, you're not going to suddenly stop being a European democracy because of OBOR. Countries in Europe which have far less Chinese money, like Hungary and Poland, are more likely to do that than Greece. If you're a sort of technical democracy, but one that doesn't have much liberalism, like Myanmar, you're probably not going to change your system. You'll still have plenty of voting going on, but it won't be a very liberal polity that emerges. And if you're basically a country that's pretty authoritarian in the first place, Zimbabwe perhaps would be an example of that, although I suppose there are elections there, then it's not going to change that. In other words, OBOR shapes itself to the contours of where it shows up. And actually, as I think you're indicating, that's perhaps more to do with recipient countries than it says very much about China itself.
So I think that's right. And that's why, in a sense, people in the West, and by the West, I usually mean Washington, are both underestimating and overestimating this challenge at the same time. It's not, in fact, an effort to overthrow democratic countries. It could be much, much worse for our interests, let's put it this way, given the volume of money that China is marshaling behind it. And there is a way to look at it in which China is actually trying to show that it can be a responsible actor within the international system, that it can help other countries develop in a mutually productive way. There are many examples of win-win projects along the Belt and Road, the Piraeus port in Greece being one of them. Not only a political win-win, but an economic win-win as well. So I would agree, and this is why I think it's important that we grasp the good while it is still presenting itself. But there is also a darker side to the Belt and Road, which is that Xi Jinping seems likely to rule for a very long time. He seems to have aspirations of greatness and of autocratic power, both within his country and abroad, far greater than what he currently wields. The fact that US-China competition has achieved a momentum of its own, and it's not clear that things will ever get better. And the fact that the One Belt, One Road concept is so vague and flexible, and that if the United States mishandles its response, and particularly if the West, including Britain and Europe, mishandle their response, it's not implausible that in 10 or 15 or 20 years, One Belt, One Road could be the name we give to the emerging Chinese geopolitical bloc that encompasses perhaps Cambodia, Iran, perhaps some countries even in Latin America, a great deal of sub-Saharan Africa, and that these countries are linked to China, not only through trade, but also through the export of weapons, to the export of tools of autocratic control like facial recognition technology and the rest, that these places ultimately play host to military bases that allow the People's Liberation Army to go global. In other words, if we respond in too hostile a way to this, it's possible that we could make it the China-led geopolitical bloc that we fear. And unlike the communist bloc in the Cold War, this would be to a large extent global in nature because so many countries are already beholden to China for trade. So I think there is a real risk that if we mishandle this, it turns into something very scary indeed. And that is why there's no time to waste as we think about how to diagnose this and how to respond effectively.
I thank you very much indeed. And there may not be time to waste, but sadly we have no more time to spend today. But one message that I don't want to shut down without giving everyone here is that if you want to find out more, and I'm sure you do after this fascinating talk, please do check out the book, which is One Belt, One Road, Chinese Power Meets the World by Eyck Freymann, who's been speaking today. Eyck, thank you so much for giving us such a stimulating and wide-ranging and nuanced talk about an immensely important issue. I think we all very much feel this is the beginning of a story rather than the end of one, but your book will be an excellent place to dive into it in much more depth, and it's now available through the usual bookstores and online websites. Please do patronize your local bookstore if you can, try to keep them going in the current pandemic. Amazon will survive, others won't, so buy them perhaps elsewhere. And thank you to all our audience, a very good number who came in today, lunchtime from around the world, I know. And please keep looking out for other events here at the University of Oxford China Centre. Thank you for being with us. And Eyck, thank you very much for a fantastic talk. And we can give you all a virtual round of applause.
Thank you, Rana, and thank you all for zooming in.